So, oh, awesome. Professor Adam Litwin is here too. And so I'm thrilled to actually, he's part of the CHRO program itself. So I'm going to be happy to share the stage with him because Professor Litwin is just an amazing speaker on this topic, has written extensively on it. My few books don't even compare to the research that Professor Litwin has done. So I'm going to actually I'll be able to talk more about the technologies, but I'm just thrilled that Professor Litwin is here. So, Professor Litwin, what I was answering right now was a question that was asking, in your estimation, what are you seeing the biggest return on investment in the HR function, practically speaking? Are you seeing it in talent acquisition? Are you seeing it in, I think you said performance management. I think the third one was, oh boy,
Workforce planning or elsewhere.
or workforce planning or elsewhere. And what I said, Professor Litwin, is actually, believe it or not, when you frame it around the question of return on investment, the biggest return on investment has actually been in the automation and augmentation, basically creating capacity by answering questions and fielding cues. And that's where the biggest bang for the buck has really been happening in the last year. That will start to change, especially as deep fake videos become easier and easier to do. So that talent acquisition is going to become the next frontier that if you don't have an answer for this, you're going to have people that are coming in that have interviewed with you and you thought they can do all the things that you said and they can't. So I'm going to hand it over to you and see if you want to add anything to that. Remember, you're on mute though, Professor. So I just want to make sure that you see that.
Uh, Professor, you'll have to unmute yourself.
There we go. Now I think we're in business. Thank you very much for that really kind and generous intro, Mike. I really appreciate it. And apologies for my tardiness, which we will ironically blame on the technology. And that will never stop. I guess so. There's so many points I can make here, and I want to make sure I'm not repeating myself. So, or repeating what you said. So if I am, Mike, just stop me. I think that the probably the strongest ROI evidence at the moment comes from leveling up the least experienced people. As you may know, there's this great landmark randomized control trial that from a U.S. tech support operation that basically showed that AI-assisted tools would deliver a huge productivity lift, something like 35% to folks in the bottom quartile of performers, but almost no gain at all for top performers. And if you think about it, that's pretty cool. The idea that it's going to narrow that productivity distribution, and it's going to do so not by, bringing down the people on top, but by actually bringing up the people on the bottom. Because if you can narrow the productivity distribution in that way, aside from the fact that it's going to increase productivity at your firm, you're actually doing something good for the people that work for you. Because in general, when you can lift productivity, you're ultimately lifting their wages too. So this means that this isn't just going to benefit you or benefit your employer, but it means that you're actually kind of thinking about all of the stakeholders in a that you'll think of as your stakeholders as a CHRO. I think the biggest implementation mistake that CHROs are making is when they treat AI as sort of a lift and shift of existing processes. And Mike was kind of hitting on this. There's all sorts of research that shows that if you can augment workers, right, if you can actually disentangle high value cognitive work, so problem solving and creativity and interpersonal connection from low value information processing, then you can actually do a lot more than just automating processes that really weren't working that well in the first place. And I think the same principle applies to HR. You don't just want to automate a performance review that wasn't really working that well in the first place. You want to rethink, for example, about what performance management can really be. And that's what AI is allowing people in the HR function to do, and people at the CHRO level to actually kind of look at the whole organization and think about. I will say a lot of this comes down to how we evaluate vendors, and that's something that CHROs and the HR function has traditionally not played a huge role in, but they should be, because these are the folks that can be demanding transparency. and they can be sort of looking at the vagueness from vendors that often impresses others in the C-suite and say, no, that's a red flag. Something like over 90% of AI vendors claim really broad data usage rights, for example. That's way more than you see from vendors in software as a service. And so it could be the CHRO, if they're in that C-suite, if they have a voice at the table that's asking questions about like, yes, so I want to know, is our data, our administrative data, is that going to train your models? Where are you going to store our data, right? Where are you going to process it? What third-party AI services do you use? And if a vendor can't explain things like that, can't answer questions like that, that should disqualify them. And those are the kinds of questions that as a CHRO, you can be asking and basically impressing the CFO and the CEO and others around you who should be asking those questions, but aren't as sensitive to things like personnel data as you will be, right? So I think these are some areas for ROI. Certainly predictive analytics in really sensitive areas in the HR function. So attrition modeling, performance evaluation. And for all these things, you want to demand human in the loop kinds of designs because increasingly regulation is going to be demanding that companies do this. And, folks have always made fun of HR for being the people that are really focused on the rules and on regulations. But, now the CFO is going to end up coming to you because, for example, the EU AI Act has high risk rules that are going to go into effect in August 2026 that classifies AI in hiring and promotions and performance reviews as high risk. So it's going to require human oversight, quality standards, traceability. And you may say, well, we barely operate in the EU. It doesn't matter. Those standards are actually going to become the standards for best practice that become the floor for really any kind of company that's operating in global space. New York City already has a local law that does this, that actually requires annual independent bias audits and candidate notification if you're doing automated employment decision making. And so again, like these are the ways that CHROs in particular, their voice, I think, is going to be especially valuable in the C-suite. And I'll just add, because at some point, I always like to point it out when we're talking about the CHRO function, AI now, I think, is reminding people that, that being a CHRO, it's like there's a pretty high cost of admission. That's not a cheap ticket. And the reason is because you're likely to be the only person in the C-suite that has a good command over the other functions. What I mean by that is you have to, as a CHRO, understand finance. You have to understand accounting. You have to understand marketing. Do you need to know these things as well as the CMO and the CFO, the chief security officer? No, but you need to be able to converse with them, right? You need to be able to consume and critique what they are saying. Now, you may say, well, that's true of everybody in the C-suite. Well, it's not, because as a CHRO or even an aspiring CHRO, that the CFO is not going to know the HR function. They're not. It's just not a requirement of being in those other jobs. So you need to have some baseline understanding of what the other core functions of the organization are and what the other core C-suite roles are. And that's really challenging. And frankly, it's a challenge that those others do not face. You're going to be the only one that has an understanding of not just of people and people issues, but even these other HR matters that come up. For example, like that data issue that I raised earlier. That's just not something that others in the C-suite are going to know. So when I think about ROI on AI, it kind of reminds me of sort of the strategic keystone that CHROs play in the C-suite.
So, Professor Litwin, we had two more questions come in. I'm going to try to merge them together.
Sure.
The first question is, how should CHROs address employee anxiety about AI replacing jobs or increasing surveillance? And then the other question is really, how does AI change the psychological contract between employer and employee? And how will we cover this in the AI in the Cornell CHRO program? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so AI anxiety is real. and we already know it's had some pretty measurable consequences. Um, there's a Deloitte survey of about 12,000 workers from now it's funny. Now I will say it's an old survey because it's from late 2024. About 12,000 workers, it's global, so it must have covered at least 15 countries. And it found that two-thirds of the workers they surveyed felt really uncertain about how AI was going to affect their job security. A higher percentage than that, expressed concerns about fairness for any kind of AI-driven performance evaluation. I've even seen some stuff in more academic publications about AI anxiety and how it leads to turnover and tension. Maybe even worse, it triggers, quiet quitting, other forms of burnout. And I think the antidote from an HR perspective is probably a leave no one behind kind of strategy. That may sound really trite, but the alternative to that would be more of a get productive or else mandate. And I've seen lots of companies do that. I think the best approach that a CHRO can take is the idea that they're going to give everyone the opportunity, they're going to give everyone the tools, and they're going to provide the training. And so, like where I've seen this done best to scale is probably at AT&T, where they have something they're calling the Futures Ready Initiative. They put $1 billion into it, and they've targeted 140,000 of their employees for retraining, and they've told them, we're gonna retrain you, we're gonna pay for it, we're gonna give you the tools, but almost all of you, I mean, literally 95% of you are going to end up having to move into new roles in our company. And so what that shows is that there is a way to kind of make this strategy work at scale, right? But I do think AI fundamentally changes the psychological contract. For those of you that, if that's not a phrase you guys know or use, it's psychological contract theory. It's been around for a long time now. And it's basically this idea that, even aside from kind of informal employment contracts and arrangements, workers and employers make implicit assumptions about their expectations for one another, sort of mutual obligations. So fair treatment, job security, development opportunities in exchange for, loyalty and effort. And when organizations implement AI, especially if that AI is going to lead to layoffs or really significant role changes, workers can definitely perceive not just that there's been this strategic business decision that's been made, but that maybe there's a violation of trust. And so CHROs need to really take this head on. They need to ensure that when strategy makers in the organization do this, they're thinking about transparency and really embedding that in their decisions. Involving employees in decision making is critically important. We know this, but for some reason, often when it comes to AI, firms forget this basic principle, right? And then also designing systems that actually preserve employee dignity. Again, these are not the things that others in the C-suite are necessarily going to think about, right? And so that's why you have to understand the motivations of the strategists and the accountants, right? And remind them, right? Like dignity matters, not just because we happen to care about people, but dignity should matter to them if the cost of turnover matters to them, right? If the cost of burnout matters to them. I think HR teams themselves actually need to develop some new capabilities too, and that's something that we'll get into um, in the course. Um, Something like there's a Korn Ferry survey that's something like 5% of HR teams actually feel prepared to implement AI effectively. And lots of CHROs in all different surveys have pointed out that AI integration isn't going to be it's not going to work effectively if people just have knowledge of the AI itself, right? They also need knowledge of the people issues involved in AI. And many CHROs feel that they don't quite have them yet. And that's part of what they need. So we need employees to develop AI skills. We need HR practitioners to develop more AI skills so they can see what's coming. And then only when they can do that can they actually really champion the kinds of big workforce transitions and transformations that the rest of the C-suite is calling for, and I think has a right to ask for, right? But it's going to have to be the CHRO that leads those. The CHRO is the only person that's going to think about the worker and the organizational implications of these changes from the start, from strategy formation to strategy implementation.
So two questions came in. One of them I'm going to answer, which is actually I'm going to answer privately. It's just, what are the likelihood of people that come in on this journey becoming CHROs? So I'll share some details with that question
Sure.
in private. But one of the questions that also came in, it picks up on something that you shared earlier with respect to evaluating vendors and red flags. So you had
Mm.
raised the point about explainability, and you had raised the point about transparency. What are some of the other kinds of things that you should be doing as an HR leader to evaluate the vendors offering AI-enabled solutions? And what red flags should you be looking for?
So those are so like I said, so I think that a big one is data ownership. Another big one is transparency. The other that I have seen recently in some of my own research, particularly in the healthcare space, is this desire vendors like to, the phrase that they've been using a lot lately is turnkey. This is a turnkey solution. And I get the sales pitch because when you show up and you're trying to sell a product, the idea that it's ready to go, that you can drop it into your workforce is super appealing. I understand that. The problem with it is it also tends to imply a certain design ethos, which is the idea that they have designed this product entirely outside of your organization, sometimes not even for organizations specifically in your sector, right? In healthcare, so we picked up on this in healthcare, where healthcare has a lot of its own unique needs, and these vendors show up with this product that seems really interesting, and it's like, wait, this actually seems more like a point of sales product than, than a healthcare specific product. And so quickly what you learn is when something is turnkey, they often want to drop on you um, an implied set of work processes. Now, in some cases, those are based on best practice. And so you're right to hear them out, right? They may actually know something about the best way to organize a process. Other times they don't know. And even when they do know, right, this is one of those cases where the very fact that they're right is not enough to make this effective in your organization. So often what vendors will do is they'll say, okay, well, it's turnkey, but it's also configurable. That's sort of the middle place on a continuum. Turnkey is one end of this continuum, customizable would be the other, and configurable is somewhere in the middle. What I always want to know when they drop the word configurable is what exactly does that mean? Are you telling me that, I can change the color of some text on a screen? Or are you telling me that really we can make some big adjustments to this product so that it augments our existing work process, or so that, maybe your product will, in a positive way, alter ours, but maybe we can also in some way alter the product to facilitate something that we do uniquely well. Again, these are the kinds of questions that when a tech vendor shows up and there's no CHRO in the room for this presentation, nobody is asking these. Tech vendors are really great. I mean, every vendor is really great at showing you the immediate first order cost reduction effects of any technology. If I were selling technology, I would probably do the same thing, especially if I knew that the only real decision maker in the room was the CFO. But when the CHRO's in the room too, you're going to ask some really hard questions that the vendor may not like. And honestly, the CFO may, scratch his or her chin and say, "What?" Except you'll point out, okay, so that immediate first order cost savings is very deceptive, right? And the CHRO is going to really push those vendors. So I actually just again in my own research, I would love to see, and I've talked about formulating these studies. I actually like see the difference in how tech vendors present their merchandise when they understand that there's a CHRO as part of the as part of the audience. I think that they definitely, in what I have seen, they have been ill prepared for the sorts of questions that CHROs ask. And again, the other C-suite members in the room are usually like, "Oh wow, we didn't really think about that," right?
Yeah.
Because typical. It's very typical of HR. A lot of the accounting is sort of second order, right? And so things
Mhm.
that look like they're an immediate cost savings may well be an immediate cost savings, but in second order, they are not a cost savings. In fact, they actually raise costs, and often not in conjunction with raising the quality of service delivery.
100%. And that's a great one. So we've gone over a few minutes, and we're going to actually field one last question here.
Sure.
This question is really going to be a little bit more that's tied to some of the topics that we do cover in the actual program. But if you could answer this in a way to actually give people an idea of where things are heading. So here's the question. In sensitive areas like performance evaluation or attrition risk modeling, there are lots of tools coming out. There are lots of predictive analytics coming out. What should HR be really where should we be leading and how should we be leading in these very sensitive areas like performance evaluation and attrition risk? And how should we be thinking about leading in this way? Because obviously the technology is going to keep evolving and getting better, but out of the
Right.
gate, it may not be able to do it. So how do we help not say no, but protect the business while we continue to grow?
It's a big one. So I think it begins probably with a mindset shift. Instead of thinking of HR as a process guardian, in sort of a defensive kind of way, we need to think of HR as a problem solver and like a business savvy one. Which, by the way, makes doing HR a lot more fun, right? So it makes our job harder, but it also, I think, makes our job a lot more exciting. I saw a governance study that characterized sort of the next generation CHRO as someone who is, fully embedded in the C-suite, fully embedded in the boardroom, but can actually shape these other parts of the organization. So they can shape enterprise strategy, they can advise on governance risks and data risks, and then they can actually try to guide a long-term talent, and that includes a succession planning strategy around that. And it turns out that corporate secretaries are largely on board for this too. I saw a survey that said that they actually expect their CHROs to become much more engaged with boards over the next few years because of all of these new issues that they need to deal with. In terms of the competencies that I think CHROs need to build immediately, um, I think two of the three of these are going to sound very familiar. One of them may not. So data literacy, certainly. One that I call orchestration, and then just ethical judgment. Data literacy, you know what that is. So it's the ability to really interrogate AI outputs critically. So not building models, although I think we can probably start learning how to do that too now, but really understanding what models are telling you and what they might be getting wrong. Orchestration is one you may not know. That's the idea that you're learning to actually design human AI teams. So thinking about tasks, which ones belong to machines, which are going to require human judgment, creativity, empathy, um, and then ethical judgment. So actually developing a governance instinct. So you know when to say no to some flashy AI solution, like we were talking about, an AI solution that doesn't really solve a real problem, or maybe it does address a real problem, but it risks people's trust in a big way. So I think those are probably the big competencies. In terms of the future of AI, this is going to sound a little trite, but like I think it's not about replacing humans because that's the low-hanging fruit, right? It's about really reorganizing work around what human beings do really well, right? Um, what's interesting is, at the moment at least, wages are rising twice as quickly in industries that are more exposed to AI compared to those that are the least exposed to AI. And that's seemingly true even in roles that, if you just look at them on the surface, they seem pretty automatable. And so to me, what this suggests is managers can't treat AI as this sort of blanket tool for enhancing productivity. They need to think about the gains to AI use being really context dependent, They vary by task. They need to think about differences in worker experience levels. Again, it seems like at the moment AI is doing more for workers who are a little less experienced, which I think is pretty cool. I think CHROs need to think about big organizational design issues when they're thinking about AI implementation. And the CHRO that understands all of these nuances, I think that CHRO is going to be the most valuable person in the room.
And on that lovely note, thank you so much, Professor Litwin. It's been a real pleasure. I always learn from you, and I think you're actually right. I've actually heard this. I sit on a few boards, and I've heard this more and more on boards that people want to see more of these sorts of human side and some of the stuff that you would actually think culture elements that would come from an HR function, and they're just not being reported on or talked about in those boardrooms. So it's a really interesting kind of space. And I think you're right. Your instinct that this is actually it's heading in that direction, and those three competencies to focus on right now, those are all three are being covered in this program. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day. Thank you everyone for hanging with us, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day ahead. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you all.